You're listening to episode number 13 of the Estranged Heart podcast, and I'm your host, Kreed Revere. Welcome back to our returning listeners, and if this is your first time here, we welcome you as well. As we begin today's episode and every other episode, I invite you to grab a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and listen with an open heart. But first, our disclaimer. I am not a therapist or a counselor. Nothing within this podcast should be considered or taken as therapy. If you are in need of therapeutic support, such as counseling, please seek out a therapist near you. First, a couple of shout outs and announcements. There is a new podcast coming soon. The name of this podcast is In the Blood, and that podcast will be a resource for anyone who has experienced the pain of losing touch with the people they love. So obviously Estrangement fits in with that. And it's due to debut in February of 2022. And the host, AC Fisher, is someone that I know of because AC and I met when I was interviewed for a segment on When the Bow Breaks podcast. And that was last January, so a year ago, almost to the day. And he's just a fabulous human being and someone who has, he's a formerly estranged and now reconciled adult child. And when I was interviewed for When the Bow Breaks, he was in the process of, at the very beginning stages of that reconciliation with his mom. And so I invite you to put that on your calendar, stick a pin in it. Again, the name of the podcast is In the Blood and will debut in February of 2022. I do believe that there is a Facebook page, and I believe there is an Instagram account already for In the Blood, so you can go there and learn a little bit more. And the second announcement I have for today's show is, after many, many requests from estranged parents and adult children to have more access to me and wanting to either share their stories and or talk and be coached and assisted with potential reconciliation with their estranged loved one, I will be giving the opportunity for you to become a Patreon for the Estranged Heart, and that's coming hopefully by February 1st. It will be a more intimate and live way of connecting with me. And so anyway, if you haven't checked out or are not familiar with Patreon, I encourage you to do so. And I believe that website is patreon.com, and that's patreon.com. Okay, so on with our episode today, and let's begin. I have 3 quotes today, and some of them are kind of lengthy, so just bear with me. The first 2 are from a book called The Language of Emotions by Carla McLaren. And the first one is, "Cry as often as you need to. It's the all-purpose healing balm of the soul." And the second one is, "If we ignore and repress an emotion, we won't erase its message. We'll just shoot the messenger and interfere with the important natural process. The unconscious then has 2 choices: to increase the intensity of the emotion and present it to one of us one more time. This is how unresolving moods or escalating emotional suffering may be activated, or to give up on us and stuff the emotional energy deep into our psyche. Now, that instinct will no longer be readable as itself, as fear or anger or despair, but it will still contain all of its original intensity and information. Usually, this squelched intensity mutates into something else, like tics, compulsions, psychosomatic illnesses, addictions, or neuroses. Repressing our emotions is a perilous way to manage them. And then the third quote is, emotionally intelligent people are able to self-manage their behaviors and navigate challenges with the best outcome in mind for themselves and their relationships, despite emotions that may be at play. Emotions contain data about the feelings you have and the reasons you feel the way you do. By Joanne Bond. So today's episode is about emotions and estrangement. Just Google the psychology of emotions, and boy howdy, like, oh my goodness, just millions of different things that come up. But this is an area that I think most people are clueless about. And when I say clueless, I don't mean stupid or, not in a derogatory way. I mean it in that it's something that is just not taught to us. And we don't understand our emotions, and therefore it's a rare thing if we don't understand our own emotions to understand the emotions of others. And as I've talked about throughout my episodes for this podcast, in a variety of different ways, emotions, they are our GPS. They are our guide system. They are giving us indicators and clues as to what is happening. But because this is something we're not taught, we don't know that that's what's happening. And so because we haven't dealt with our own emotions, and it is very typical, especially in our culture. I can't speak for other cultures because I don't live them, but in our culture, to shove those emotions down at all cost, unless they are the quote-unquote nice, respectable, and acceptable emotions. Being joy, happiness, positivity, all these things that are all the feel-good emotions. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not all of your emotions. And just because you shove them down does not mean that you're not living with them. Our repressed emotions are most often running our shows. I heard a quote the other day. Someone talked about how, what we have today is just a bunch of little children, little 4-year-olds running around in adult bodies. And that is so spot on. It's so spot on. Because this isn't something that we are taught, we learn from our parents, and I'm talking to estranged parents as well, not just estranged adult children, but I'm also talking to estranged parents here. We are taught by our parents how to deal with emotions, and whether that is dealing with the emotions by actively acknowledging them and working with them, or by suppressing them. And how do we learn? We don't learn by mom and dad sitting us down and saying, okay, little Susie, this is how we are going to work with our emotions today. That's not how, I don't know about you, but I certainly did not grow up that way. I learned emotions by observing my parents. And my mom, and again, Mom, if you're listening, this is Mom and Dad, if you're listening, this is not a derogatory thing. These are just insights that I have learned over my time working through my estrangement experience, working through my reconciliation experience, and learning more about myself and doing my own inner work. But my mom has always been and still remains one, although she has gotten much better at allowing the more difficult emotions. But growing up, it was, if you're not happy and laughing and having a good time, then go to your room because nobody wants to hear anything else about it. And I was, for the most part, a very angry child. And I've learned that being an angry child generally comes from some sort of emotional disturbance when we're young and we don't know how to handle the big emotions that come with that. And we're alone with those emotions. So we all know how to be happy and joyful and celebrate and have a good time because those emotions are quote unquote acceptable. So we can be with others when we're having those emotions. But oftentimes when we're having the other emotions is when we're alone in the pain that is that we're feeling when we're having these emotions. And my father was very much the, he was angry all the time. And I now know today, I remember growing up with hearing most everyone talk about how angry my father was. He's just such an angry person. He's angry all the time. And that's how they defined my father. And then here I come along being angry. Well, then they define me by my anger. When in reality, my father, as well as myself, had a whole host of emotions. We weren't just made up solely of being angry all the time, but that's what presented itself up front. And that's what scared people off. And so when people get scared off, they retreat. And so there you are left alone with these big emotions and big feelings. And I now know that my father's history, after having learned more about his childhood, I absolutely understand why he was angry for all those years. Like, if he weren't angry, I would have been worried. And so I understand that, right? I'm not going to get into the details of that because that's his story to tell. But I would have been angry. So my story was I was angry, right? My parents had divorced. My father and I were super close, and then they divorced, and my dad's gone for 3 years, and I'm left wondering, what have I done to cause him to go away, right? A lot of estranged parents say, my kids grew up in the same parent household, and there was no divorce, and they had everything they could have ever wanted, and things like that. However, did you have arguments? Did you have disagreements? How did you handle those disagreements in front of your children? What did your children witness? Right? And even if it was not big, angry, explosive emotions, right? Maybe it was just everybody shuts up and doesn't say anything about it. And so emotions are not acceptable to be discussed. And so they internalize that. Children internalize that. And then it becomes all sorts of things that we see today when we're looking at, workaholics and a lot of addictions. A lot of addictions come from very difficult emotional challenges as very young children. So anyway, when I Googled emotions today, and the 5 most common emotions I found so interesting were joy, fear, sadness, disgust, and anger. And some said 7 and included shame and surprise with those. But if we take just those 5, of those 5 emotions, most common emotions that we experience on a daily basis, only one of those is quote unquote the feel-good emotion, the good, the acceptable emotion, joy. So we have, billions of people walking around on this planet that are experiencing these 5 emotions, and the only one we ever want to pay attention to is 1 out of 5. So what exactly is happening to the other 4 emotions when we're feeling those? Where do we go with those emotions? How are they expressed? Well, oftentimes they're not. Oftentimes they're shoved down because nobody wants to deal with those. because we haven't dealt with our own, right? And so when we have kiddos, we don't want to deal with their big emotions because we haven't dealt with our own. And so we don't know how. And so we're telling them to just shh and be quiet and get over it, man up, move on. And so when we do that, if we look beneath the surface of behaviors down the road as adults, it's super important to look beneath the surface of whatever behaviors you're seeing, because the behaviors that are happening are what I call cover-ups for these most often negative emotions that were never dealt with or allowed to be when we were kids. And so those emotions, those behaviors then become addictions and sometimes psychosis, mental illnesses, all sorts of quote unquote ugly things in life, right? Because we're running from our emotions. We're running from these negative feelings. And so we don't know how to express them in healthy ways. So they're shoved down. We don't even know about them. They're in our subconscious. And that's where me going to therapy, that's when I got in touch with why was I so angry, right? Again, I was in therapy before my estrangement happened, and I have continued therapy post-estrangement and post-reconciliation because I wanted to find out more about me and why I was doing and behaving the way I was doing and behaving. And I wanted to find out, why was I triggered when my kids said or did such and such? Why did it hurt me so bad? Why did I just want to curl up in a ball and go hide for days and weeks on end? Why did I get angry at them? When really what they had said or done was really not a big thing. But in the moment I couldn't see that. And so when I got into therapy, that's what helped me learn to look beneath the surface. And that basically is looking at my childhood, right? Was getting in touch with what happened when I was a kid that I experienced big emotions that were not dealt with. Or when I say not dealt with, they could either not be dealt with or dealt with in a very harmful way, right? Being abused, being, shamed and chastised in front of other people for having emotions. Especially men, young boys, are told to suck it up, man up, right? Not to be emotional at all. And so they shoved all those feelings down, and then they learn to just go along with whomever is coming into their life, and they just kind of follow their lead because they've never been allowed to stand up for their feelings. Right? And I see that in some cases with when I talk with estranged parents, when they have a son, generally a son with a daughter-in-law, who is quote unquote called the gatekeeper. And I usually see there comes out some sort of story behind the scenes where this child has, not been allowed to be who they are or express their emotions in ways that they want or need to when they're children. And so then when they become adults, they do it in very less than healthy ways. And so, just as, and one of the things that I find often when working with estranged parents and adult children is estranged parents say, well, my kid is doing doing this, that, and the other thing as far as a behavior that's not acceptable. And when I look at what the parents are doing, I'm thinking to myself, just as your emotions are driving your behaviors, so too are the emotions of your adult child driving theirs. right? Two sides of the same coin. So when we're pointing that proverbial finger at our adult children and saying, I don't appreciate or I don't like the way that they are behaving, and I think that it needs to be this way or that way, well, maybe they think that about us. Maybe they think that we should be behaving a particular way or not behaving in a particular way. And because we're electing not to, just as they are not, right? Then they choose to separate from us. So again, kind of reflecting back on that, whenever I hear anyone, if I hear an estranged parent talking about their child and their child's behaviors, I think about, oh, well, I wonder what the parents' behaviors are. And when I talk with an estranged adult child, I think to myself, and they're talking about their estranged parents' behavior, I'm thinking, oh, I wonder what the estranged adult child's behaviors are. I'm always thinking about the other person. Because it's clues. It's giving us, what did they grow up with? You know, and same thing, if I'm talking with an estranged adult child, I'm thinking, wonder what their parent grew up with, what their childhood was like. Because that's what's running their behaviors, most likely. Not in every case. Don't want to talk in absolutes here because nothing is absolute, but in the majority of cases. Because we just, and you know, the older generation, it's just not something that was ever a part of the process, right? It was never something I don't recall my grandmother ever hearing stories of my grandmother ever sitting down with my mom and talking about her emotions and how she was handling those and things like that. Like, it just wasn't a thing. And so it's not something we learn, but doesn't mean we can't learn it now. And that's what's important. And that's what I did when I got myself into therapy. So what now? Now that we have this information about, the emotions and, in most estranged cases, I think that most estranged people would say, well, that's all fine and dandy, Kreed, but all of these emotions have absolutely destroyed the relationship that I have with my mother or with my kiddos, with my adult children. So now what? Right? And I would say that, to learn more about emotional intelligence, it's easy to feel, defensive and angry at your estranged person when they don't appreciate you or don't appreciate your support and things like that. But if you look at your feelings when that happens, right? Don't be looking at their behaviors. Look at your feelings as to, why am I feeling this way? Why am I angry with them right now? Why do I feel shame? And that may take time for you to sort out what you're actually feeling, right? Because this is not something we go to school and learn. So having to learn that we are even feeling different feelings that aren't just happy or sad, right? We have to learn what that's like. What does that feel like in our body? When I feel shame, this is what happens. This is how my body responds. Those types of things. And so it's important to, instead of reacting in anger or what have you, is to take a step back and start asking different questions. Instead of pointing the finger out there, to start turning it around and asking inside. Right? And for the most part, I'm talking to parents here because, and I know, don't come at me with your hate mail. I know that most parents feel they get so angry at me when I say, it's really up to the parent to set the tone, to start changing their relationship with the child. And parents are like, they're adult children, they should know, and they've been living life and they've got kids of their own and they ought to know that treating me this way is not right, it's not fair, and all of these things. And you're right, maybe they should know. However, because you are a parent, there will always be a power differential. Because you are the parent and they are the child. Whether you're 30 and they're 5, or whether you're 80 and they're 55. It doesn't matter. You inherently hold the power because you are the parent. Now, I know that in the circles of estrangement, a lot of the psychotherapists say, the person who holds the power in the relationship is the one who cares the least. Yes and no. I just don't fully agree with that. I think that parents have much more power than they believe that they do. And part of that is the power dynamic of just being a parent. And so I just challenge you to begin to observe your emotions and your behaviors. Why are you feeling when someone says such and such to you? What am I feeling? And then why am I feeling that? Right? To start asking those questions, and you begin asking that just in your daily interactions. Hopefully you're able to begin doing that with relationships that you have that aren't so triggering, right? Maybe just, a coworker that just kind of rubs you the wrong way, or a neighbor that just kind of rubs you the wrong way. Well, when they're rubbing you the wrong way, stopping and thinking, what am I feeling? And why am I feeling that? Right? Why do I want to just go over and, sledgehammer the fence between myself and the neighbor so I don't, sledgehammer their head? Why am I feeling that way? When I want to just, go and shout out to the world that I think that they're just a horrible human being. Well, why am I feeling that way? What am I feeling? Why am I feeling that way? And then that will eventually lead you to be able to do that with your children and with more intense relationships and more triggering relationships. So when you become aware of your emotions, you can change your behavior. You have the power to influence those outcomes with your what is called emotional intelligence and behavior. Something that I read also in doing my research for today's episode is with greater emotional intelligence, you can become aware of your triggers and your true feelings in order to choose a different behavior. To do this, you must be able to sharpen your awareness of your emotions and resist acting on impulse. This assures you maximize your chances of replacing emotional reactions, judgments, and assumptions of others with understanding, empathy, and communication, which connect you with others. So this is what I was just talking about, right? When we can become aware of what's driving our behaviors, when we become aware of our emotions, then we can choose different behaviors. We can choose them. And I know that may sound crazy and like, no, you can't. And, when I'm so triggered, I can't control anything. Well, yeah, you can with practice. But you've got to get curious about why you're feeling what you're feeling and why you're having the behaviors you're having. And the same thing goes for your children, is for you as a parent to get curious about what is happening beneath the scenes, beneath the surface. What is happening? And even if you can do this even if you're not in contact with your child, because I hear that too. Well, I can't know anything if I can't have contact with them. That's not true. I started getting curious about my kids before I reconciled with him. I was forever asking, why? What are they doing? Why? Wonder why this is happening. What happened, so long ago that is making them make these choices and things that I just don't understand. And then I got into therapy and I was like, I don't understand this. And so I started working through that with my therapist. And I just kept following the breadcrumbs well before I was ever reconciled. Because you know your child's childhood. For the most part, you may not know every detail of it, but you for the most part, you know. And so you begin to look back and you begin to think back. And what did they observe from me? What did they observe from their other parent? What did they observe from grandparents and from aunts and uncles and cousins and neighbors and close friends? What did they observe? Because that's what's running their show. And what's running their show are the emotions, generally the negative emotions that were not allowed to be expressed. And again, I know that you weren't taught this. I know that you did not know this. I didn't know this. I had no idea that I was hurting my children when I would not allow them to express their emotions. I had no idea. I do now. And I have apologized, and I will always apologize for not allowing them to have their emotions. So I'm just saying, look back at how your children were raised. And maybe you ask someone else who isn't you or your husband or your wife or your partner, but someone else that could look at it from a different perspective. Look at your child's childhood from a different perspective than you or them. And ask them, what did you see? What did you observe? So, Google emotional intelligence. Learn more about that. I will have in the show notes some referral or recommendations for some things that I referenced today. But again, the book, The Language of Emotions by Carla McLaren, and that's McLaren. And you can find that on Amazon. And then you could Google her. She also has a great article on understanding and befriending anger. So if you go to her website, which is carlamclaren.com. And then a couple of other things will be on there as well. So if you're interested. So this brings episode 13 to a close. I hope that this time together was time you feel well spent and that you're able to find some takeaway nuggets to help you on your journey wherever you may be on your estrangement and reconciliation path. If you feel you have received something helpful or positive from this podcast, please consider following us, sharing this podcast with others, and perhaps leaving us a positive review. And lastly, if you are an estranged parent or an estranged adult child and would like to have your story shared on the podcast, anonymously or not, please reach out via email at theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Again, theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Until next time.